Hey you guys, this is Professor Vitt, and I wanted to present a little video to you guys to help you understand Plato's Cave. Now, there's something super important here. This video is intended to briefly explain, to give you just a real overview of Plato's Cave, the allegory of the cave that's drawn from Plato's Republic. In no sense will this video be enough for you to write the paper. You will also need to read the allegory of the cave itself. I've included that link in the Canvas course. So you'll also need to read the allegory of the cave, but this is hopefully enough to give you a running start so that it'll make some sense as to what's going on. So, why don't we begin with the story and the major elements that we're going to be covering. Part of the problem with talking about the cave here is that it actually has a number of different aspects. It ties into Plato's metaphysics, his epistemology, his political philosophy, and so there's a lot to talk about, but we're just going to be talking about it with regard to knowledge and what it means to have knowledge and sort of rule from knowledge or make a decision on the basis of knowledge alone. Let me remove that. There we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on here to our major components of Plato's Cave. Come on, baby. No, it's going to make me do it this way. So there are going to be four portions of the cave that we're going to talk about, four elements of the cave. Very briefly, the first one will be that the cave is a story about people who are imprisoned. They are chained to look a certain way, and they can only see shadows of things, not the things themselves. Then there will be discussion of someone being removed from this cave, forcibly removed from this cave. Thirdly, that person, when removed from the cave, will then perceive reality for how it is, right? They'll be out of the dark, so to speak. They'll see things as they are, and then they are forced to return to the cave and try and impart their knowledge to the people who are still in the cave. And you can see how this is intended. You can already see where this will attach to your paper, right? That you have an idea that you will find someone who is in a state of ignorance, and then you will demonstrate to me how you know that they're in a state of ignorance, and then you'll explain how you know that you've moved your head and you can see the light, so to speak, and they cannot. So let's begin. Plato's Cave begins with a story that a number of people are imprisoned. They're held in chains. He actually says chains. They're forced to look at a wall. Behind this wall there is a fire, and in between the fire and the people, someone moves across occasionally, and all that these people can see are the shadows that are cast by these objects on the wall. And we can imagine that these people would even make a game, perhaps, of seeing these things and try to guess which one would come next or recognize them more quickly. But ultimately, what is most important is that these people who are viewing these shadows believe that the shadows themselves are real. So they think that what they're looking at are the actual objects, but in fact, they're not. However, because these people have been chained and kept in a cave, they have no way of knowing this. As these people move, and again, between the fire and the cave, objects pass along, and the light casts a shadow. Now, these people don't know that these are objects. They think that the shadows that are cast are actually the things that they're perceiving. They don't know what's moving behind them because they're unable to move their heads to see. Now, in the allegory of the cave, a person is taken from the cave. One of these prisoners is dragged up to the light. And it's a little more detailed than that in the cave. First, they're forced to turn and look at the fire. And as their eyes adjust to the light, it hurts and it burns. Many of us have had this experience if you've ever gone to a movie and then immediately left out that side door. When you open your eyes, it's almost painful until your lights adjust and they close so that there's not so much light moving in on you. And this is meant to be an example or a metaphor for knowledge, that very often when we learn things, we are unsettled, that the things that we learn cause us pain and strife, right? And so that's a way of demonstrating this, that someone gets moved from the cave And as they're moving from the cave and their eyes are adjusting, it's a painful process. Education is not always pleasant and fun, right? And we've talked about this. Sometimes it's like lost innocence. It's valuable to have that knowledge, but sometimes when you find out the way the world really is, it's not what you thought, and that can be cause for sorrow and anguish, right? It doesn't have to be. Education can also be very positive, but for what Plato wants to say here, we can think along those lines. Now, the next step in the story is that this person is removed from the cave and they're able to see the sun and see how the sun illuminates the world, and they can see all the objects around them. This sun, and we'll talk about this perhaps a little bit later in class if we have time, is actually a way for Plato to talk about the form of the good. But we don't need to worry about that here. We can just think of that prisoner leaving the cave, seeing the sun, and it changes everything. It changes how they see themselves, how they see the objects around them, how they see the interrelatedness of objects and things around them for perhaps the first time ever. You can see that this person's journey has left them in a much better state, right? She's much happier now being out in the sun. You can see that's represented by the clothing. There's this idea of a transformation, that knowledge can be transformative. It can be good for someone's soul to learn something, even if it is difficult at first to bear. Now, once this person is done, they have to be forced back down into the cave. They have to be pushed back down in the cave in order to try and explain this to their friends who are still prisoners down below. And of course, you can imagine that this would be very difficult to explain everything that you've seen to someone who's still chained and locked in a state of ignorance. You could say, no, these things are not shadows, these are objects. And yet, with those people still stuck, still imprisoned in their own knowledge, it's very, very hard to get them to believe this. And in fact, when you return to the cave, this person might be greeted with outright hostility. You should be thinking about Socrates here, right? The hostility that he faced at the hands of fellow Athenians for trying to get them to understand. You think you know what holiness is? You think you know what justice is? You think you know what a good life is? Why don't you tell me? And so you can keep that in the back of your mind, but the idea is that there's a compulsion that someone needs to be. People don't want to return to a state of ignorance, but people want to be ultimately brought out of this state. And sometimes people want to keep their position, and sometimes people want to change. And this kind of leads us to the end of this particular video. But what I wanted to just stress is think about how this will fit in with the paper, right? Just in reverse order, someone being forced to return back to the cave. This is you demonstrating to somebody, yeah, I used to think that way, but I don't anymore, and here's why. Right? And the idea is that if we're rational in the way that Socrates is rational to his fellow Athenians, then we would be able to help people out of the cave. That's why you're all going to school now. You're changing yourselves. Not everybody goes to college, right? But you are. And that's going to change and transform you for the better. And then you are back out in the world and you're trying to tell people what you've learned. You see reality and truth, hopefully, better for the first time, and you may be reluctant. You don't want to talk to these folks. Oh gosh, I used to think this way. I don't want to do it anymore. Or it's not always a pleasant thing. And then your education, right? Well, this will be the part where you tell me. You're going to tell me a little bit about how you know what you know, and how you were removed from the cave, how you became more well informed than someone else. And then, of course, you'll be telling me about the people who are imprisoned, the positions that people are imprisoned in. So this could be, right, and I'll go into this in greater detail here, but this would be really the state of ignorance that you think someone else is in. Okay, you guys, that should cover it. That's enough. Again, it's not a substitute. It cannot be a substitute for reading the Allegory of the Cave, but it will give you the basic building blocks that'll let you read it more productively and more efficiently. if you have any questions at any point for me, please do not hesitate to let me know. I'm happy to help. All right, you guys, good luck.